Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories. The city is quiet as the evening sets in, and the glow of streetlights casts long shadows over the empty streets. Inside a modest house, the atmosphere is calm but tense. Henry stands at the window looking out over the street. The world seems still, but his mind is far from peaceful. He stares into the darkness as if waiting for something. "You've been standing there for a while, haven't you?" Sarah, his wife, asks from behind him, holding a steaming cup of tea. Henry turns and forces a smile. "Just thinking. I need a break from the city. I was thinking we could take a hike tomorrow. Maybe get out into the forest for a bit." Sarah looks at him, exhausted but willing to entertain the idea. "That sounds nice. We haven't gone for a walk in the woods for a while, have we? It's been ages." Henry's eyes light up, the idea clearly appealing to him. He runs a hand through his hair. "Yeah, we could use it. Just the four of us, no distractions. I feel like we've been stuck here for too long." Their two kids, 12-year-old Sam and 7-year-old Lily, are already asleep upstairs. The house is quiet, the only sound coming from the occasional car passing by. But the thought of escaping the city for a while appeals to Henry in a way he can't quite explain. "All right, let's do it," Sarah agrees, setting the tea down on the table. "Just make sure we get everything ready." Henry nods and smiles, a sense of anticipation building inside him. The next morning they pack up the car, ready for the adventure. The kids are excited, chattering as they pile into the back seat. Sarah grabs a basket filled with snacks and some drinks, while Henry takes the map and navigates the route. The journey feels like the start of something new, something refreshing. The moment they enter the forest, Henry can feel the shift. The air feels different, heavier. It's as if the world has suddenly become quiet and still, the sounds of the city far behind them. The trees stand tall and imposing, the sun barely breaking through the dense canopy above. "This place looks amazing," Sarah says, her voice soft as she takes in the scenery. The kids are already out of the car, running toward a clearing where the grass is thick and inviting. Henry parks the car and starts unloading the picnic supplies. The forest feels peaceful, but there's a strange energy in the air that Henry can't ignore. It's as if the woods are watching them, waiting. "You all right?" Sarah asks, noticing Henry staring off into the trees. "Yeah, just something feels a little off," Henry responds, shaking his head as if to clear it. "Maybe I'm just tired. Let's make the most of it." The kids run around, laughing and playing while Henry sets up the blankets. Sarah helps, though her gaze frequently drifts toward the woods. There's a tension in the air that she can't shake. "Let's just enjoy the day," she says, trying to reassure herself as much as him. They settle down and Henry takes out his camera, snapping a few pictures of the kids. But as he does, the feeling of unease continues to grow. It's like the forest itself is closing in around them. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig feels louder, more deliberate. "I swear I heard something," Sarah says, standing up and looking around. Henry looks up from his camera. "What do you mean? The wind?" But when he looks around, the woods don't feel right. The shadows seem too deep, too long. The branches of the trees sway, but the air is still. "Maybe we should head back soon," Sarah suggests, her voice now a little shaky. Before Henry can respond, there's a sudden noise, the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" Sam asks, his voice full of curiosity but tinged with uncertainty. Henry's heart races. He stands up quickly and looks into the trees, trying to see what made the sound. "It's probably just a deer or something," Henry says, though his voice is unsteady. But then they hear it again, closer this time. A heavy step, followed by the crack of a branch snapping. "That's not a deer," Sarah says, her eyes wide with fear. Henry swallows hard and looks at the kids, who are suddenly silent, their excitement replaced by a quiet unease. The noise is unmistakable now, something or someone is out there, hidden in the shadows of the forest. "We need to leave now," Henry says, the sense of danger growing stronger. But as they start packing up, the noises grow louder. The air feels colder. The shadows between the trees seem to deepen, stretching toward them. It's as if the forest itself is alive, closing in on them. As they scramble to gather their things, a sudden gust of wind blows through the forest, rustling the leaves, but it's more than just the wind, it feels as if the trees are whispering. The sound is faint at first, like murmurs carried through the air. Henry can't quite place it, but the sensation is all too real. The forest is alive, listening to them. Let's go. Now, Henry says, his voice shaking. He grabs the basket and begins walking back toward the car, trying to stay calm for his family. But as they move through the trees, the sound of footsteps follows them, keeping pace. At first, it's faint, but it becomes impossible to ignore. A rustling in the bushes, then a faint whisper, too quiet to make out, just enough to unsettle. Henry's heart pounds in his chest, his eyes darting back and forth between the trees, expecting something to leap out at any moment. Suddenly, a figure steps into view. It's a man standing just at the edge of their path, his face hidden in shadow. "What the hell?" Henry says under his breath, instinctively stepping closer to Sarah and the kids. The man doesn't move, just stands there, staring blankly into the forest. His clothes are ragged, his hair long and matted, but his eyes, those eyes seem eerily empty. "Are you okay?" Sarah asks, stepping toward him, but there's hesitation in her voice. Something about this man doesn't sit right. The man slowly turns his head toward them, his eyes glinting strangely in the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," he mutters, his voice hoarse. "The woods. They don't let go." Before anyone can respond, he turns and disappears back into the trees, vanishing as suddenly as he appeared. "What the hell was that?" Henry whispers, barely believing what he saw. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," Sarah says, her voice trembling. They keep walking, but now the atmosphere feels thicker, suffocating. The woods seem to close in around them, the trees pressing together as if moving of their own accord. Henry can feel his anxiety rising, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Then the whispers return, this time louder, closer. It's as if the trees themselves are murmuring, warning them, or maybe mocking them. Henry quickens his pace, urging the family to keep up. "Dad, what's that sound?" Sam asks, his voice small, scared. Henry looks around, trying to make sense of it. The air feels electric now, like a storm is brewing, but the sky above is clear. Then he hears it, footsteps again, but this time they're not just following. They're coming from all directions, surrounding them. "Stay close," Henry commands, gripping Sarah's hand tightly as they move faster, their footsteps growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet gives way with a loud crack. A large branch breaks off a tree above them and falls to the ground, narrowly missing Sam. The impact is enough to send them all into a panic, the group scattering, running in different directions. "Stay together," Henry shouts, but the sound of his voice is swallowed by the whispers. As they reconvene, Henry can see the fear in his family's eyes and something else, something that wasn't there before. The forest is darker, colder, and the shadows stretch unnaturally long. "We need to get back to the car now," Henry yells, trying to remain in control, though the panic is evident in his voice. They run toward the clearing where the car is parked, but with every step, the trees seem to shift. The path in front of them no longer looks the same, it's as if the forest itself is warping, distorting, making it impossible to find their way back. "What is happening?" Sarah whispers, her voice cracking. Henry's mind races. They've only been in the forest for a few hours, but everything feels wrong. The ground beneath them seems to pulse, as though the earth itself is alive. Then they see it. At the edge of the clearing, a figure steps out of the trees. A woman. Her face is pale, her eyes black as coal. She is wearing a long, flowing dress that seems to shimmer in the dim light, but her movements are jerky, unnatural. She's holding something in her hand, a small, twisted branch like a cane but with sharp, gnarled ends. "Stay back," Henry warns, his voice shaking, his body tense with terror. The woman tilts her head, her eyes locking onto him with a predatory intensity. "You shouldn't have come," she says, her voice a low hiss. Before Henry can react, the ground trembles beneath them and the trees around them begin to creak and groan, as if waking from a long slumber. "What is this? What do you want?" Sarah screams. The woman takes a step forward, and then another, her movements like a predator stalking its prey. The air grows colder, the wind picking up speed, pushing against them. Henry tries to move, but his feet feel like they're stuck in place. "We're not leaving, are we?" Sam whispers, his voice small and terrified. And that's when Henry realizes, they never were meant to leave. The forest had already claimed them. The woman smiles, but it's not a smile, it's a cruel, knowing grin. "You've come too far," she whispers, her voice now a sickening rasp. The trees around them begin to sway violently, their branches lashing out like limbs of some great, unseen beast. Henry can feel the pressure building in his chest, the air thick with an oppressive force. "Henry?" Sarah gasps, her hand tightening in his as if she's trying to hold on to him as if he's slipping away. In the distance they hear it, the sound of rushing water, growing louder like the roar of a flood. The trees bend and the ground beneath them shakes. Henry doesn't know what's happening, but he knows one thing for sure. The forest is alive and it wants them. With a burst of adrenaline, Henry grabs Sarah and the kids, pushing through the thicket of trees. The woman's voice follows them, echoing in their minds, wrapping around them like a vice. You can't escape. The forest will take you. But it's too late. The path is gone, the forest closing in from all sides. The trees seem to press against them, the shadows consuming them. In that moment Henry knows they're trapped. And as the darkness closes in, he can't help but wonder, is there any escape? Or have they crossed the point of no return? The forest has already claimed them. The trees are closing in on them, their branches twisting like claws. The air grows colder, biting as if the very earth itself is rejecting them. Henry, with Sarah and the kids close behind, stumbles through the underbrush. His heart races, his breath's coming in shallow gasps, but he refuses to stop. The whispers are louder now, mingling with the roar of the invisible floodwaters that seem to be drawing closer. It's as if the very forest itself is alive, suffocating them, pulling them deeper into its grasp. Suddenly Henry stumbles into an open clearing. He looks around, disoriented. This is not where they were before. The trees behind them seem to fade into a fog, and the ground feels solid again. He stops to catch his breath, his mind racing. It's over? Sarah whispers, still holding on to him tightly. Her eyes scan the darkness, half expecting the woman or something worse to emerge from the trees. But there's nothing. Only silence. We made it, Henry says, more to himself than to anyone else, as if trying to convince himself that they're safe. Then in the distance a faint light flickers. It's the car, that's it. We're almost there, Henry shouts, leading the family toward it. But as they approach the vehicle, something doesn't feel right. The car, which was parked just moments ago, is now completely different. The headlights flicker on, casting long eerie shadows across the clearing. The air is thick with tension, but no one is there. Henry approaches cautiously, his hand reaching for the door. But when he opens it, instead of the familiar interior, he sees nothing but darkness inside the car, as though it's empty. Or waiting, Henry, Sarah says in a voice filled with dread. Then they hear it. A voice, soft and distant, calling from the trees behind them. You can never leave. It's the woman's voice. Closer now, but somehow not quite from the same direction. The trees shift once more, as though the forest is moving around them. A deep, unsettling hum vibrates in the air, the ground beneath them quivering. The children scream. The figure appears again, this time standing right in front of them, much closer than before. Her eyes are wide black voids. Her mouth stretches into a grotesque, inhuman grin. There is no escape, she whispers, and this time her voice seems to echo from every direction, like the very forest is speaking through her. Henry takes a step back, a cold sweat covering his brow. He knows they're not escaping. This is no longer about running. They're trapped in a nightmare that has no end. And then, as if some unseen force pulls them, everything begins to blur. The trees fade away, the forest vanishes, and for a split second Henry feels weightless, suspended in darkness. A distant, haunting laugh echoes through the void. The camera pans over the now empty clearing. The ground is still. The trees are silent. But the air feels thick, oppressive. The car sits there, its headlights still flickering as if waiting. Then, just as the camera pulls away, something moves, a shadow just at the edge of the screen. A figure, draped in a tattered coat, stands at the tree line. The face is barely visible, but there's something in the way it watches the clearing, as if it's been there all along. As if it never left. The screen fades to black, and the last sound heard is the whisper, "You can never leave." The wind howled through the towering pines as the last light of day slipped behind the mountains. The forest was alive, but not in a comforting way. The leaves rustled like whispers, the kind that made you feel watched. John Carver, a man of 55, had always found solace in the forest. Years of hiking had hardened him, turning the forest from a wilderness into a familiar friend. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was an uneasy stillness, a feeling in the air that couldn't be shaken. As John walked deeper into the woods, the dense trees seemed to close in on him. His boots crunched against the dry leaves, but even that sound felt distant, muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. The sun had long set, but he didn't mind. The trail was familiar, the night was cool but manageable. Yet, as the shadows grew longer and the moon began its climb, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching him. John reached a small clearing where he often stopped to rest. He took off his backpack and set it down on a large rock, glancing around the quiet forest. As he pulled out his water bottle, a sudden noise cut through the silence. A twig snapped in the distance. His eyes narrowed. There shouldn't be anyone out here. This was his spot. His quiet place. He stood, slowly listening intently. The noise came again, followed by the sound of something moving between the trees, too fast, too erratic to be an animal. His heart skipped. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding strange in the stillness. No answer. Only the rustle of leaves. John hesitated. He'd been out here alone countless times, but never had he felt this sense of unease, like something was waiting for him to make a mistake. He grabbed his flashlight from his backpack and swept it across the clearing but saw nothing. A chill crept up his spine as the beam danced over the trees, then stopped. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the light, a figure stood, too still, too silent. John's breath caught in his throat. Was it someone else on the trail? He couldn't be sure. His instincts told him to run, but his curiosity rooted him to the spot. The figure took a step forward, its face hidden in shadow. "Who's there?" John called, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly tilted its head to the side as if studying him. John's grip tightened on his flashlight. There was something wrong about the way it moved, like it wasn't quite human. Then, without warning, the figure turned and vanished into the trees, leaving nothing behind but the whisper of the wind. John stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to follow or retreat. Something told him this wasn't just a random hiker or a lost traveler. Something dark was at work in these woods. John took a deep breath, trying to steady his pulse. The figure's sudden disappearance left him unsettled, but curiosity had always driven him, and this time it was no different. He took a hesitant step forward, flashlight in hand, and followed the path where the figure had vanished. The trees seemed darker now, the air heavier. The familiar sounds of the forest were absent, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against his ears. His heart began to race again. As John walked deeper into the woods, the sensation of being watched returned. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig underfoot felt amplified. He paused, listening intently. Another noise. This time closer. Something was moving in the forest, staying just out of his reach. "Hello?" he called out again, his voice sounding weak and unsteady. No response. Only the stillness. John reached the edge of a small creek, where he knelt to take a drink. The sound of water was calming, but as he looked into the dark ripples, he saw something in the reflection, a figure standing behind him, too close. His blood ran cold. He spun around, but there was nothing. Just empty trees and the whisper of wind. Shaken, John rose quickly and began walking back toward the clearing, but the trail seemed different. The trees loomed larger, the shadows stretched unnaturally. It was as if the forest itself had shifted. His mind raced as he tried to rationalize what was happening. Was he imagining it? The strange figure, the whispers, the unsettling feeling? He had to find out what was going on. As John neared the clearing, he saw another figure, a man this time, standing at the edge of the trees. This one was different. He looked familiar, but John couldn't place him. The man's face was pale, expressionless, and his eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to follow John's every movement. "Are you lost?" John asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond. He just stared, his mouth moving silently as if saying something John couldn't hear. John's stomach twisted. There was something unnatural about him. Suddenly, the man's eyes flicked down to John's flashlight, then back up at him. His lips parted, but instead of words, a low, guttural sound emerged from deep within his chest. A warning, maybe. A growl. Before John could react, the man lunged forward, but something in the forest, the trees, the shadows, the very ground beneath him, seemed to shift. The air grew thick, and the man's form flickered, like a bad signal on a television screen. He was gone in an instant, swallowed by the darkness. John stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. What was happening? Panicked, John sprinted back down the path, the forest around him now a maze of shadows, every rustle and creak amplified in his ears. The trees seemed to close in, the path growing narrower with every step. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. The figure had to be real. It was impossible to imagine something so vivid. He was being hunted, he didn't know by what, but he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The ground beneath him shifted and suddenly the trail disappeared. He found himself standing at the edge of a steep drop, the forest now silent, suffocatingly still. A distant howl broke the silence, sending a chill through his bones. John's flashlight flickered, then died, plunging him into darkness. He reached for his pack, fumbling for the spare batteries, but his hand froze when he heard it, the sound of heavy breathing just behind him. He slowly turned, heart hammering. The figure was there again, standing at the very edge of the cliff. But this time, its face was clear, pale, hollow eyes staring into him, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. It spoke, but its voice was garbled, a distorted whisper carried by the wind. "Get out of the forest." John couldn't move. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The figure advanced, its legs unnaturally long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Every step it took brought it closer, but it never seemed to touch the ground. In a desperate bid, John reached for his knife, but as he pulled it from its sheath, the forest seemed to respond. The trees groaned, their branches twisting and reaching toward him like hands, pulling him into the darkness. The figure's smile widened. Suddenly the ground beneath him crumbled. He slipped, falling backward, the edge of the cliff rushing toward him. With a final scream, John was swallowed by the abyss, the last thing he saw being the figure's glowing eyes. The darkness swallowed John whole. For a moment he felt weightless, falling through an endless void. But then with a jarring thud he hit the ground. Pain shot through his body, but it was distant, as if his senses were numbed by the very forest around him. He lay there, gasping for air, trying to steady his mind. The last thing he remembered was the figure, its eyes, its twisted grin. He was sure he was gone. He was sure he was dead. But when he opened his eyes, he found himself back on the trail. The forest was still and quiet again, but something felt off. The trees, the leaves, even the air, everything felt wrong. The path stretched before him, but it wasn't the same trail he had known for years. It twisted and turned in unnatural ways. John scrambled to his feet, panic rising in his chest. He was alone. Completely alone. Or so he thought. As he stumbled through the woods trying to find his bearings, he heard a voice. A whisper at first, then louder. John. He froze. It was his name. But it wasn't him calling it. The figure appeared again, this time not from the shadows but standing right before him. "You're still here?" the figure whispered, its voice impossibly low and distant. Its grin was gone, replaced with an empty expression that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow. John opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, constricted. The figure tilted its head to the side, its eyes never leaving John's. "You shouldn't have stayed. You've crossed the line." John tried to step back, but his body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the very earth beneath him. His legs couldn't move. "You can't leave," the figure said, its voice now echoing, vibrating through John's bones. "Not once you've seen what you shouldn't." And then it vanished. John stood there in the silent forest, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on him. He wasn't dead. He wasn't free. The forest was trapping him, holding him in a place where he couldn't escape, couldn't outrun the horrors he had seen. But as he stood motionless, a new thought crept into his mind, a horrifying realization. Had he ever really left the forest? The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself, always bringing him to the same point. It was as if the forest had become his prison, one he couldn't escape, not even with death. The trees, once familiar, now seemed to watch him with malevolent intent. They were no longer just trees, they were part of something much darker, something that knew him, something that had always known him. John took a step forward, then another, unsure if he was walking or merely being pulled along. The whispers grew louder, the air thicker. And just as the forest began to close in, a final whisper drifted through the trees, soft and chilling. "You'll never leave, John. Not now. Not ever."